Welcome to this module. With the background images and the images being sized, at least as a first step before we have a look at responsive design later, it's time to have a look at dimensions, sizes and units, because there is more than pixels. What does this mean and what will we do in this module? Well, we will start by having a look at the theory, because so far the main unit used on our website is pixels and partially percentages, but there are more units available which help us to change the size of our boxes or of the font, for example. We'll of course dive into that in this module. After that, we'll have a look at percentages and the containing block, because although we use percentages so far, we are not totally sure what drives the actual size of our element, because the percentage has to refer to another element, because it has to be the percentage of something, and we will find out what this something actually is. After that, we'll also have a look at min width and max width. These are some properties, some special width properties, which by the way can also be applied for the height property, and we will see how we can use these properties to do our first steps towards a more responsive design. After that, we'll understand rem and m, and rem is not a band, REM. Sorry, I had to make this joke, I know it's not a good one. But basically, rem and m are units that are based on the actual font size on our website. What we can do with these, how these work, let's find out all this in this module. And after we understood rem and m, we'll also have a look at VW and VH. I could make another bad joke about VW, I won't do that now, but these are also units we can use, and because of that, we should also understand how we can use them and when we can use them. So that's what's inside this module, and with that, I think it's time to start. And a good starting point again would be our current project, because as we said a few seconds ago, we already applied some pixels and percentages to our website. So I think it makes sense to have a closer look at that before we dive deeper. So that's our website right here. I'm on the customers page that we created in the last module. And if we look at the code right here, for example, for this image, then we can see, let me drag this up a bit, then we can see that we applied a width of 100% to this image. Now, we could argue, well, it's not occupying 100% of the space. That's true. And you probably know why this is the case, because this image is part of this container right here. And this container has a width of 65%. And apparently, this width, the 65%, refers to this div right here. As we can see, this div seems to have a width of 100%, we can see it right there, and because of that, our image only has 65% of width. So if I drag it around, we can see the image increases and decreases the image size. However, as you can see already, this was a lot of guessing of probably, and it should refer to this and that element. And as you can imagine, CSS is not about it should do something like that. In this course, we want to understand why things are behaving the way they behave and how we can change this behavior. Because of that, we have to take a closer look at this percentage behavior in this module, and we have to understand what is actually the element that this percentage relates to. So that's the first thing I wanted to show you. We have this percentage applied, and because of that, our website is a bit more dynamic. However, if you look at the font size, for example, right here, you host, help me, etc., you can see this size doesn't change if I increase the width. Why should it? It's still readable. However, if I zoom in into our website, like that, you can see that the font size increases significantly. Now, you could say this is clear because if somebody cannot read the text, he can increase the size. And I would totally agree. But I would also say that with this behavior, we totally give the browser the chance to decide how our site should be zoomed and how the different elements on our site should be zoomed. And I don't think that's a good idea, because although we want to allow our user to increase the font size, for example, we want to make sure that the general look, so that the proportions between different font sizes, for example, are still met. Therefore, working like this with the pixels, like we did it so far, if we inspect that, we only have pixels right here. If I scroll down, you can see we have a font size of 20 pixels. So using a fixed font size of pixels and letting the browser zoom doing the work is not the best idea. Let's maybe also change the default font size. We found that menu already in one of the earlier modules of this course. So if we go right here to Chrome and Preferences, then we have here in this appearance menu the option to change the default font size. At the moment, this is medium, the recommended one. Now, if I change this to very large, for example, you can see this already increases the font size on this side right here. But on our website, well, this only affects parts of the fonts. As you can see, the font size here in the navbar increased. The same thing is true for our footer right here. But this text right here didn't change at all. And this makes sense because, as we just saw, we defined a font size of 20 pixels for this text. So how should it increase? For the elements in the navbar and in the footer, for example, right here, we didn't define any font size. So what happens right here is that as soon as the visitor of our website increases the font size, the default font size will also be increased based on these default settings. And now you could argue, well, then everything is all right. We don't have to apply any font sizing because it's all done by the browser settings. And again, that's probably not the behavior you want to have, because we want to have different font sizes on our website. And at the same time, we want to allow the visitor to display the website with the default font size of his choice though. So as we can see, with fixed pixels, this wasn't possible. With not applying any font size, it's also not possible because, well, each font will have the same size then. So let's maybe go back to the settings and change it back to medium as a first step. Like that. Now it looks better again. And let's then find out if we have more units available, which might allow us to be a little bit more flexible. And this flexibility refers to the font size, but also to the general sizing of our elements. But because, as we already saw, we applied the percentage value already to size our image, for example, but we didn't totally understand what drives this percentage value and what it refers to. Additionally, there might be alternatives to percentages, so it might make sense to also have a look at these. Pixels, percentages, and more. What do I mean by that? Well, so far we worked with two units basically. We worked with the pixels, with the unit of px, and we worked with percentages, so with the percentage sign basically. Now, in addition to that, we got more units available in CSS. For example, we have the root m. The root m is written with a unit of rem. Root m or rem is a unit that refers to the font size. We'll see how this works throughout this module. In connection with rem, we also have m, written just like that, m from a unit perspective. M and rem both refer to the font size, but there is also one important difference between these two units. We'll also find out what this difference is, of course. In addition to that, we also have the viewport height, written as VH, and we have the viewport width, written as VW. Also two more units we didn't use so far, but we'll dive deeper into these too. The problem now is, well, you probably have this question mark in your head now, because we basically understood pixels so far, but we are not even sure about the percentages and what they actually refer to. And then I come over with new units and with rem and m and so on. So this is maybe a bit too much. But actually, we can break down these units and the issues arising in connection with that to three core questions. The first question probably is this one. Which properties can I use in connection with these units? Because we have all these units, but just applying a unit alone, well, won't help us a lot. So we have to find out if there are properties which are really made or basically made to apply some of these units, maybe all of them, or a specific unit. We'll find out that. But the first question really is, what can I do with these units? We'll of course answer this question. The second question is, how is the size calculated? I talked about that already a bit regarding the percentages, because we always need something like a reference point. We'll have a look at the percentages, and I said that rem and m are kind of connected to the font size. And for VH and VW, well, it's called viewport height, viewport width. This might be the viewport, and you're right, by the way, but we have to find out how exactly this calculation works. And then, after we understood this, the last question probably is, what's the right unit to choose right now? Because we know that we have different properties, we know how it's calculated, but which unit should I apply for which properties? Are there any best practices, or can you give me some advice? The good news is, I think I can give you some advice, but this will happen at the end of this module, of course. But why don't we just dive directly into the first question? Which properties can I use, or where units matter? So here you can find the question again. Because basically we have our box model. Max already explained that to you, so you're probably an expert in the meanwhile. In your box model you have the content right here. And if we think about this content, then we have the background color. For the background color, we don't need units, but the font size, I think this is probably a property where a unit, for example pixels, as we did it so far, definitely makes sense. But maybe there is more than pixels that we can use for the font size. If we then come back to our box model and think about the next step, this normally is the padding. Well, and if we think about the padding, which specifies the distance between the content and the border, well, then the padding itself would be a really good property to apply a specific unit that defines the size of this padding. The same thing is true for the border actually. The border is also a property where applying a specific unit definitely makes sense. And if we follow our box model, then this is of course also true for our margin right here. Now with that we see that we have already 4 properties where units definitely matter. Now let's continue. What else do we have in our box model? Well, we have this right here, the width, and we have this right here, the height. Because height and width are also properties where we have to specify a unit. This can be a pixel or a percentage as we saw it so far. But maybe there are more units we can apply also. And maybe there is also a unit which makes more or less sense. This is also something we have to find out. By the way, at the moment I indicated the width and the height with box sizing being set to border box, just to remind you of that. But that's also something you know already by heart, hopefully. However, with height and width, there are only, well, basically 4 more properties where units actually matter. This one right here, the top and bottom properties, so properties that can be used after we applied the position property. I showed you how this works 2 modules ago, so you should also know about these properties. And with top and bottom, we also have these one right here, left and right, so definitely also properties where applying units makes a lot of sense. With that, we now understood 2 things, that we have different units that we can use, and that we have different properties where applying these units makes sense. The connection between the properties and the units is not perfect yet. We'll change that in this module. But with that, the first question, so which properties can I use? I think this one is answered. And with that, we can now move on to the second question we had on the last slide. How is the size now actually calculated for the different units? So how is the size calculated? Let's have a look at that for the different units we have. The first category would be absolute lengths. What happens right here is that these absolute lengths mostly ignore user settings. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, if we apply pixels, for example, we saw that in the example on our website on the customer page with the font size of 20 pixels. If I do that and our user changes the default font size, well, then the font size on the website won't change because the user settings, as it's written right here, are ignored. So we specify a pixel and that's it. The user cannot change it. Yes, he can change it by zooming in with the browser, but we learned that this is probably not the behavior that we want. In addition to this pixel as an absolute length, we also have centimeters, millimeters, and more. But these are not units you should use in web development, because centimeters and millimeters, these are units you use if you have something on paper, because on paper, 1 centimeter is 1 centimeter. On a display, 1 centimeter definitely is not equal to 1 centimeter. So using these units in the end will just lead to a total mess. So we should avoid these, we won't use these. Therefore, I just wanted to show you that these units are also existing, but we will stick to pixels when it comes to absolute lengths. With that, we finished the first category of units. Now, what's the second category? Well, the second category are viewport lengths. Viewport lengths, as the name says actually, adjust the size of the element we apply to according to the viewport. The viewport lengths can be applied with the VH value, so viewport height, but also with viewport width, I showed you that already. And we have more, we have Vmin and Vmax. We'll have a look at that once we understood VH and VW. But generally, these lengths allow us to adjust our size more dynamically to the viewport. You learn what the viewport is, basically the visible part of our website in the browser. So that's the second category, viewport lengths. And then we have a third one, font relative lengths. Well, as the name says, font relative lengths adjust to the default font size. And if you remember back what I said in the beginning, then this rem with my bad REM joke, this is the unit that allows you to do that. I also told you that we have M and that there is an important difference. We will find out more about this difference. And we also have more units available that adjust to the font size. But as you can see, I didn't even mention them because rem and M are really the units you have to know when it comes to font relative lengths. And with that, there is only one category left. And this category is a category we already know, the percentages. We applied these a lot already on our website. But the interesting thing is that although we applied the percentages, we didn't understand how it works in detail, and more importantly, it's even a special case. Now, why is the percentage value a special case? Well, because we have to answer the question how this box size is actually calculated if we use the percentage unit, well, to calculate the box size. Because the situation normally is the following. You have a div, this can have a padding and a border like here. And this div is normally nested into another div. This could be the body element, this could be another parent element, anything like that. Well, and now the question is, of course, this box height right here as a percentage value and this box width right here also as a percentage. Well, what is this height and this width referring to? So if I add a width of 80%, what is this 80%? Is it 80% of the parent, 80% of the body element, of the HTML element, or of anything else we don't know so far? This is exactly the problem we have to take a closer look right now. And for that, we have to understand the so-called containing block. So how does this percentage unit work? What does it refer to? For that, I prepared 3 rules to remember. And we will have a look at each of these rules separately and also have a look at our project to see how these rules apply in practice. Now, let's dive into it right now. And the starting point, of course, is an element. So this is the element we applied a percentage unit to, for example, to the width property. Now, the important thing is that this is a special element. Why is it special? Because it has this declaration also applied, position fixed. And by the way, that's also how you can see how things tie together in this course, because although we will not position our elements in this module, the position property definitely has an impact onto the way the percentage unit behaves. Now, how does this impact work? Well, the reference point for such an element with a percentage unit is called the containing block. This containing block is simply, for example, an element, a parent element, for example, which has a width of, let's say, 100 pixels applied. if this parent is the containing block, and we will find out in this and the next videos how we can identify the containing block, well, then our child, so our element right here, would have a width of, let's say, 10 pixels if we applied a width of 10% to it. So 10% width of the child would be 10 pixels if the containing block has a width of 100 pixels. Now the issue is that the containing block depends on the position property applied to our element right here. And in case the position property or the value for this property that we applied is fixed, then the containing block is not an element, it's the viewport. And that's actually quite nice because if you remember back the position module, then we also had that relationship between a fixed positioned element and the viewport. However, as I said, this time it's not about positioning. So let's go back onto our website and see how this behaves in practice. So I'm back on the customers page, but I'm actually more interested into our navbar right here. Because this navbar, if we inspect it, as we can see, has the position fixed declaration applied. And as we just saw, because of that, this width of 100% should refer to the viewport. A good indication is that if we change the size of the viewport like that, we can also see that the navbar changes. But let's play around a bit with the width to really make sure that this is the case. For that, let's remember that we now have a width of 882 pixels. This means if I go back to the code and not to the customers CSS file, but to the shared CSS file, because that's where our header is located, or the selector for our header. And right here we need this class selector, main header. Right here we have the 100%. And if I now reduce it to 50%, let's say, and go back and reload the page, we can see that the navbar decreased its size to only 50%. So this should be, as we can see it, 441 pixels. Before we had 882, so 50% now. And more interestingly, if I increase the size of the viewport right here by increasing it, we can see that the navbar also increases and decreases. So basically, we can change it back to 100% like that and reload the page. Because with that, we understood that whenever we have an element which has the position fixed declaration applied and a percentage unit, well, the containing block is the viewport. This was the first rule to remember. After the first rule comes the second one, and this one also starts with an element, but as you can imagine, this is again a special element, because this time we again have a percentage unit applied, but we don't have position fixed, but position absolute as a declaration right here. Now with that different position value, the containing block also changed. Previously we had the viewport. Now we have an ancestor. And which ancestor this is, we will find that out in a few seconds. But the important thing is that the percentage now, so the percentage unit of our element, refers to this ancestor's content plus the padding. That's really important. So I repeat that, the percentage unit of our element with the position absolute declaration refers to the ancestor's content plus padding. So if we again have a percentage unit for the width for our element, we will take the width of the ancestor's content and padding as the containing block. The question now is, which element is now the containing block? Because this time, as we see it, it's obviously an element. And this element simply has one of these position properties applied. Now, to say it in simple words, the containing block for an element with the position absolute declaration applied is the closest ancestor which is not position static. That's actually how you can remember that. Now, as we did it for the first rule, let's also have a look at our website and see if we can find an example for the second rule. For that, I will now go back to our starting page, because if you remember back in the position module how we positioned this slogan right here, then you might remember that this slogan, if we select it, has a position property with a value of absolute, so exactly what we need. And then if we have a look at the direct parent in this case, so our section element with the product overview ID, we can see that this element has position relative applied. So basically a position property different from static, and by that exactly what we were looking for. With that, if we go back to our code now, and this time we don't need the shared CSS file, we need the main CSS file. And in here we have the product overview, that's the ID selector. Let me show you it again in the index.html file maybe. This is this index.html file right here. Because here we have our section, so that's the element I'm talking about. This section has the product overview ID, and in there we have our slogan, so child and parent in this case. So the parent has this position relative, and the child, our slogan with this ID selector, has position absolute. Now we already applied 2 percentage values right here. The funny thing is that we did apply these, although we didn't totally understand what the containing block actually was, but we will find that out now. But before we play around with these values, I would like to add width with a value of 100%, because actually what we should see now is that the width of our slogan right here, which currently only includes the content, well, should increase after I reload the page, like that. Let's inspect it again, let's see. We can see indeed that our slogan now apparently increased its width. We can also see it here in the DevTools. It has the 100% width applied with a value of 912 pixels. Now, it's not totally displayed. It's partially empty right here. We'll see why this happens in a few seconds. But if I now have a look at the parent, so at the section ID right here, so at the section element with the product overview ID, then we can see that this parent also has a width of 912 pixels. And the interesting thing is, if you remember back what we saw on the slide, that this width includes both the content and the padding. We can also see this down here in the DevTools. We have 892 for the content, and then we have a padding of left and right of 10 pixels each, with that 912. And because of that, apparently our rule to remember seems to be correct. You could also say, well, I don't trust you. Can you prove to me that the slogan right here doesn't again refer to the viewport right here, because the navbar, which refers to the viewport, we know that now, has also width of 912 pixels. Well, the good thing is I can easily prove this to you by simply changing the width of the containing block, or the element where I say that it would be the containing block, to 50%. Because if the containing block now has a width of 50%, and the child in there, so our element, a width of 100%, well, then, let's see, the slogan has now a width of 456 pixels, and our containing block has a width of 456 pixels too. That's again just the width of the content and the border. And because of that, I think we saw that the second rule to remember is applied right here. Now, regarding this little gap we have to the left, you can see it right here. This gap is simply due to our left property applied right here. If I set this to 0, of course, to 0, like that, and reload the page, you can see that now we have the same width for our two elements right here. However, I don't want to set this to 0. I would like to set this to 3% again, and the width can actually be deleted. We don't need it here. I just wanted to show you how this works. With that, we forgot to increase the width to 100% for the containing block though. Let's change this. And with that, we got back the look that we had before. One thing that I would like to show you though is that we could now of course also say that we don't use bottom 5%, but bottom 0 maybe, like that. If I do that, we would stick our slogan to the bottom. As you can see it, here the margin begins, and that's where also the slogan is stuck to the bottom. If I go back and change bottom to top, for example, like that, then we have a 0 distance to the top, right here. And if I add top 50%, for example, like that, then we would have the slogan positioned exactly in the middle of the containing block. We can see it right here. This, it's hard to see, but the upper part of the border, not of the border, of the margin, sorry for that, now is the 50% limit that we defined. And if I turn this around and say bottom 50%, like that, then you will see that the element, I'll keep my mouse cursor right here. So round about here is the upper part, and if I now reload the page, you can see that I'm now right here at this part of the image. And this simply now is, as you can see it, the lower part of our slogan right here. Because with 50% bottom, we specified the distance between the bottom of our slogan and the bottom of the containing block. And with top, we specified the distance of the top of our slogan and the top of our containing block. With that, we understood the second rule to remember, and we can change this back to bottom, I think it was 5%, like that. I think this looked better, like this, yeah. And yeah, now we can continue with the third rule to remember. Now, what is the third rule to remember when it comes to the positioning unit? Well, no surprise right here, we have an element. Again, we applied the percentage unit to it. And this time we have, well, what do we have? We have position static or position relative applied right here. If that is the case, then the containing block again is an ancestor, like we had it before. But this time, it's only the content of the ancestor, so not content and padding, like we had it before when our element had the position absolute declaration applied. But with position static or relative, it's only the content. Now, how do we now identify the containing block? So which is the ancestor we refer to? Well, the ancestor is simply the closest ancestor, which is a block level element. And with that, we can now finish this slide actually and jump back to our project and see if we can also find an example for our third rule to remember in our project. So what we need is basically an element which has a percentage unit applied already maybe, and which is either not positioned at all, so position static, or relatively positioned. Now, if we go to our customers page right here, then I think that our image container might be a good example for that. So if we go into our main element right here, then we can see that we have our div, this main div right here, this wrapping div. Then we have the testimonial class. And inside this testimonial class, we have this image container right here. If we scroll down, we can see we applied a width of 65%. I showed you that in the beginning of this module also, but we don't have any position property applied. From a code perspective, we can find that if we go to the customers folder and to this index.html file, and right here, you can see the testimonial class and here the testimonial image container. So these are the classes we will probably work with now. So let's now open the customer CSS file. And here we need the testimonial image container class right here. Because what we will do now is we will now increase the width of this container from 65% to 100%, like that. If I do that and reload the page, you can see that the image increased dramatically. Now, why is this happening? Well, because our element right here, so this one, this testimonial class, now takes the closest ancestor, which is a block level element, which is the case for this div right here with the testimonial class, as the containing block. And if we inspect that right here and go down there, we can see that this div has a width of 912 pixels. And with that, our testimonial image container now also has this width applied, because that's the width of 100%. If I would reduce that width now, right here, to 50%, for example, like that, and go back and reload the page, the image would decrease again, because, let's see, the containing block still has a width of 912 pixels. You can see it right here. But the div inside of it, so our element with the percentage unit, now only has half of it. That's also really important. It refers to 50% of the actual content. As we can see right here, 912 is the actual content. This means if I go to our testimonial right here and now add a padding of, let's say, 0 top and bottom and 10 pixels left right, and reload the page, we can see that we have some movement here and maybe also a slight movement of the image. I told you it wouldn't change. Let's see why it changed. Well, this is the container. The container now has a width of 892 pixels only and 10 padding or 20 padding. You remember why, right? Because we added box sizing border box to our project. Therefore, if I add a padding to our element right here, well, then the padding will be added and this will decrease the width of our content. The interesting thing though is that if everything worked correctly, our image now, or our image container, sorry for that, should have a width of 50% of 892, which should be 446. The interesting thing now is if I go back and change the position of our image container right here to relative, because you remember this third rule applies to both position static and relative right here. If you remember the relative positioning, we know that this should actually not have an impact onto our image right now or onto the positioning of the image. Let's see if this works if I reload the page. It looks still fine. And as we can see, the container, of course, still has 892 of width, and the image still has 446 of a width. So this is working for both static and relative positioning. But what happens now if I turn our container into an inline element? This will probably break the entire website, but let's see if the relation still is fine. So I will add display inline now. Let's see how this works. Because as I said, this third rule only applies if our element with the percentage unit is static or relative. And then it looks for the closest ancestor, which is a block level element. So by turning this div into an inline element, this should not be true anymore. So let's reload the page. As we can see, the page is a bit messed up, but it's still working generally. So if I now look for our testimonial class right here, you can see it only has a width of 744 pixels now. Why is this the case? Because it's set to auto, which makes sense as we have now an inline element. But what happened to our image container right here? This still has a width of 456 pixels. But let me see. We still have the width of 50% applied. Now, let's have a look at the index.html file and see what the next ancestor could be, which is a block level element. We can see this first ancestor, the testimonial class, is not working anymore because it's an inline element. But this div now here, this wrapping div, this should be the ancestor we need. And if we inspect that div right here, then we can see that this div has a width of 912 pixels. And with that, we found the answer to this question. Now that this div is not a block level element anymore, the closest ancestor is this wrapping div. And with that, we changed the containing block from the testimonial class to this wrapping div. So let's change this back again. Otherwise, we will kind of mess up our website right here and also remove the padding and change the width of the image container back to 65% because this is where we have been, and also remove the position relative declaration down here like that. So if we reload the page now, everything looks the way it did before. We now understand why this 65% value right here is referring to our testimonial class right there, because this is the closest ancestor, which is a block level element. And with that, we also understood this third rule to remember. However, there is one important thing that I would like to show you. Because whenever you work with the height in a percentage unit, in cases like that, then the containing block could lead to a behavior which you would not expect. Let's have a look at that behavior and how we can quickly fix it in the next video. So what is this behavior I was referring to? Well, basically we have the same situation that we had for the third rule. So we have our element with the position static or position relative declaration. And that's important, we have the height property, that's important, the height property applied with a percentage unit. This means that the percentage value depends on the containing block, which is the closest ancestor, which is a block level element. So that's the situation we have. In contrast to the starting situation we had right there, the ancestor now also has to be an element with position static or position relative applied. That's important. So with this starting scenario, we can now go back to our website and add some code to see why this scenario can lead to an, well, at least unexpected behavior. So back on our customers page, I would like to add a new element. This element will be a so-called backdrop. The backdrop has the purpose to cover the entire website, so it should be on top of all the other elements we have, because we will soon, in the next module to be more precise, add a pop-up window, you could say, which should be on top once you click a button. Below that pop-up, we want to have this backdrop, this slightly transparent backdrop, and behind that backdrop, all the rest of the website should be located. We'll dive deeper into this pop-up and how to create it in the next module, as I said. The important thing for now is that we need to create a new element which has a width of 100% and a height of 100%. To do that, we go to our code, specifically to the index.html file right here in the customers folder. And then we go, well, below our body opening tag right here and add a div, no content in this div. It only has the class backdrop because that's what it's going to be. Don't forget to save that. And as we will need this backdrop in all our HTML files, we now have to go to the shared CSS file right here. In there, we add this selector, this backdrop selector below our body selector. And let's do this now. So select the backdrop class. And now I will add a position property to this selector. Why am I doing this? Well, as I said, as I called it, unexpected behavior only occurs if our element has position static or relative applied. Now, to be honest, we will create that backdrop in the end with position fixed because that's normally the way you do it. So what I'm showing you right here is just a temporary solution with the goal to show you this behavior I was talking about. But this solution will be changed soon. Just keep that in mind. Nevertheless, I will now apply position relative because, as I said, the backdrop should be on top of the other elements, and position static will not allow us to add a z-index, which we can do with position relative. So let's add a z-index of 100 maybe, and then we need a width of 100% and also a height of 100% because the backdrop should cover the entire page. And then some background color, maybe RGBA, let's say 0, 0, 0, and 0.5. This is basically black with a slight transparency. So as I said, so that you can see the other elements below, but you can see that the focus now is on that pop-up above the backdrop. And with that, if we save that and go back to the page and reload it, we cannot see a thing right here. And that's probably unexpected. Now let's inspect that and see what happened. We can see that we have our backdrop right here below our body element. So this is working. And as we applied position relative, the containing block should be the closest ancestor, which is a block level element. And undoubtedly, our body element is a block level element. So this should be the ancestor. Now, this body element has a width of almost 940 pixels and a height of 993 pixels. Let's see what happened to our backdrop right here. Well, as we can see, the width was overtaken from the containing block. This worked fine with the 100%, but the height was not overtaken. And that's the interesting thing, right? Apparently, we were able to get the width, but not the height. Now, what caused this issue? If we inspect that, we can see that the height is not defined right here. And while for the width, this is not a big problem because it can use the value it finds right here, for the height, this doesn't work because the height is only defined by the content of our body right here, but this information does not suffice to make this height 100% declaration work in our case. Now we have multiple ways to solve this issue, and we'll also dive into another approach throughout this module. But if we want to solve this with percentages only, the following way is one easy workaround to make sure that we can use this height 100% way. For that, we have to go back to our shared CSS file right here, and now add the HTML selector, this one. Here we add height 100%, like that. And now we also add this height declaration right here to our body element. Because what will work then is, if we go back and reload the page, we can first see that the backdrop is working apparently. It moved down the other elements below it because it's relatively positioned, so it stays in the document flow. And the backdrop also doesn't cover the elements down here. We'll dive into the reasons for that in a few seconds. But the interesting thing is that now we added the 100% height to the HTML element right here, to the body right there. And with this declaration right here, we are now also able to make this height value right here, 822, which is basically the same one that we have in the body, to make this work. So this is this quick workaround I wanted to show you. Regarding the issue we have right now that basically, well, this element is above the others, well, this can be solved easily, of course. What we can do is we can simply go back to our backdrop and now change the position value from relative to absolute, for example. If we do that, we don't need that trick, as I would call it, so we can get rid of these height declarations right here. And if we now reload the page, you can see that the backdrop is working. This is fine. There are two problems though. The first problem is that if we scroll down, well, it still doesn't stick to the viewport. And the second problem is this gap up here. So regarding this gap up here, this is simply due to margin collapsing. Because if we go into our main element, into the div, and now open or click onto the testimonial class, we can see that we added a margin to it right here, a margin top and this margin. And if we unselect this and the other margin, then we can see that the backdrop covers the entire page. This is a typical case of margin collapsing, a concept Max already explained to you, and therefore you can see what you learn in this course really happens when you create your websites. However, we have to activate that for the moment because we won't remove that margins. And before we talk about this issue down here, I want to think about the reason why this is working now actually. Because as you saw, I removed this 100% height declarations, and nevertheless, the backdrop generally works, besides that margin collapsing stuff. The reason for that is that if we use position absolute for our element, then the conditional block would be the closest ancestor, which has a position property different from static applied. That's not the case for us because neither body nor HTML have the position property applied. And if that's the case, so if you don't have such a position property for the ancestors, then the position absolute declaration leads to the same behavior as position fixed. This means the percentage value refers to the viewport as the containing block. That's the reason why this is working right here. Nevertheless, if we scroll down, we can see that it, well, of course, doesn't stick to the viewport. It just takes the height and the width, the percentage values, based on the viewport, but it behaves like a normal, absolutely positioned element. Therefore, if we now change position absolute to position fixed right here and reload the page, we can see that our backdrop is basically working. We still have this margin collapsing issue though. This issue can be fixed quickly though. If we now just add top 0 and left 0 right here as two new properties, and now reload our page, we can see that our backdrop is working perfectly. And with that, we added this backdrop, and in one of the later lectures of this module, I will show you another unit which also allows us to solve this in an alternative way, because we will use the VH and VW unit, which refers to the viewport, which will basically lead to the same result, but with a different solution. But generally, our viewport is working fine now. The only problem is that we don't have the viewport on all of our pages, because it should also be on the starting page and on the packages page. And the other issue is that we cannot click around anymore because our backdrop is now, well, basically on top of all the other elements. So let's first add maybe display none right here to make it disappear. And if we now reload, we can again click onto our website. And now we just have to add the element, so right here, our div class backdrop, to our index.html file in the packages folder, right here, like that, and in the main index.html file, also below the body, right here, like that. Now let's save all that. And with that, we saw how we can fix this strange behavior with height 100%. And we also saw one way how to quickly add such a backdrop. It's not the final version yet though, because as I said, we will learn how to use a different approach. And of course, we also have to add some JavaScript, because if the only way to make this backdrop appear and disappear is adding display none or not, well, not the best way probably. But with that, we have a good status now, and we can continue in our module. Time for a quick tip, because we already talked about the fact that we can change the font size in the browser settings right here. If I change it to very large, like that, and go back to my website, we can see that all the font sizes which were not specified by us, like this text right here, where we defined the font size of 20 pixels, all the other font sizes changed because of that browser settings. That's the normal behavior. Probably there is no reason to change that. There can be cases though where you say that you want to change the font size for the entire HTML element from the beginning, depending on the browser settings. You can do this if you go to our shared CSS file, for example, add an HTML selector like this, and now say font size should be not 100%. You could do that, but this doesn't add a lot of value because it will simply, well, overtake the browser settings, which is the behavior we already have. But you could say you would like to change the font size to 75% of the browser settings by default. If you do that, you can see that the font size for this navigation items decreases to, well, 75% of this default value. And with that, you have a direct impact onto the default settings by default. Nevertheless, we will not follow this approach because we will define the font size specifically for the different parts on our website. I just wanted to show you that this is possible. And by the way, we can also change back the font size to medium. I think this looks better. So as I said, I just wanted to show you that this is possible, that you can do that. And if you have a specific case where you want to do it, you can do it like this with the percentage value. But normally you can keep it like that. And with that, we can now continue with the next video where we will have a look at the percentage value once again, one last time actually, and also see how we can use it in combination with the min and max width property. Let's find out how this works in the next lecture. Before we dive into other units we didn't use so far, let me show you an interesting combination of pixels and percentages. Because although we will talk about responsive design in a separate module, the current behavior we can see right here, that the image gets smaller and smaller. This is nice. As you can see, the formatting is not perfect. As I said, we'll fix that in the corresponding module. But if we increase the size, we can see that our image gets bigger and bigger. And although we love our customers, I think that's a bit too big. Therefore, let's do our first steps towards a responsive design right now. For that, let's quickly recap how this image or the size of this image is defined. Because the image is inside this image container. Here we have the image. The image has a width of 100%. It's 100% of its containing block, which is this testimonial image container class right here. And this has a width of 65% of its containing block, which is the testimonial class. So the entire page width right here, as we can see it. Now, wouldn't it be great if we could limit the size of this container? Because if the image has a width of 100% of our container, well, if the container wouldn't get, well, bigger and bigger and bigger, then the image will also stay smaller. We can do this, as I said, with the combination of pixels and percentages. So let's go back to our code, specifically to the customer CSS file, this one right here. And here we can see our image, we just had a look at that, and our image container. And this 65%, this width we applied, is fine. I think it doesn't look bad. It fits to the structure of the page. But now let us add a second property, the so-called max width property. This one right here. Now, what's the idea behind that? With the width right here, we have this percentage value. This means the image increases and increases depending on the width of our device. But if we now add a fixed value as a maximum width, we could restrict that width to this maximum we define. And with that, our image wouldn't get bigger than we want it to be. For example, if we inspect our image, we can see it has like 573 pixels now, which is already quite big, but let's say we fix it to 580 pixels. So if we do that right here and reload the page, you can see that nothing changed. And if I decrease the size, it still gets smaller and smaller. But if I increase the size now, can you see it? Right here, as soon as we reach our limit that we defined, these 580 pixels, our image cannot get any bigger. And that's of course a big improvement, because imagine visiting our site on a really big device, a TV screen for example. I think it wouldn't be a good look if you would just see the entire screen filled with these two images. Therefore, this max width property is a really easy way to make sure that you restrict the maximum size of your images. What you could also do is, you could for example change the max width to a, let's say, min width right here, and say that the min width shouldn't be smaller than, for example, let's say this size right here. So this is 350 pixels, let's say. So this is also possible, of course. We can specify a min width also, like that, not 250, 350 pixels, like that. So with that, we can see that our image doesn't get smaller than right here, what we intended. As you can see, it will stay the way it is, although that's not the perfect behavior yet, as you can see it. But if we increase the size, it will increase and increase. Therefore, we will stick to our max width for the moment, because this worked better, as I would say. And we will come back to the mobile design, so we will ensure that the behavior we have for the smaller screen also works perfectly in the responsive design module. The important thing to keep in mind for you is that with the combination of a width property with a percentage value and a max width defined with a fixed value, pixels in our case, you can make sure that your website also is displayed in a nice way on really big screens, or with the min width value, you can make sure that certain elements are not displayed smaller than intended by you. We will dive deeper into these two properties when we work with the responsive design. I just wanted to make sure that you have these concepts in mind as we talk about units. But with that, we can now continue and finally leave the world of percentages and pixels and have a closer look at fonts, because our font size is not perfect yet. And if I look at our customers page, for example, I can see a lot of pixels right here, for example. Now for the fonts, we have better options than pixels. So let's have a look at rem and m in the next lecture. So let's understand m and rem now. M and rem are units which are calculated based on the font size. Now what does this mean? Well, back on our customers page, we already learned that if we go to our settings right here, that the user can change the font size. For example, to very large, like that. If we go back to our page, we saw that the navbar font size increases, but the text right here stays the same. This is simply due to the fact that our testimonial class, this one right here, has a font size applied, a font size property by us of 20 pixels. This means, let me change it back again to the recommended one, the default value, the default font size, that the navbar gets smaller again, but right here, our class doesn't change because we have this font size applied. That's the first issue we have actually, because I said that already in one of the earlier lectures. If our user, our website visitor, wants to increase the font size, well, we should allow him to do this. Therefore, definitely something we have to improve. However, let's dive a bit deeper into this class now. Because inside this class, we have the image container, but that's not really a font size topic right now. But this testimonial info class right here, this one also has a font size probably. As we can see, it inherits the font size from the testimonial class. So basically the font size also is 20 pixels right here. We talked about inheritance in general, so this is probably clear. However, if I look at the different elements inside our class here, these are not equally sized, to be honest. Because if we select this h1 element right here, we can see that the inheritance didn't work. We can see it right there, it was overwritten. But there was a font size of 2m applied. This was applied by the browser because it's an h1 element, a special element, and therefore the Chrome browser added this 2m font size to it. Now, what is 2m in pixels now? Let's go to the Computer tab. Here we can untick that Show All tab. And if we then go down, we can see something really interesting here. Because the font size applied for this h1 element is 40 pixels. And this is And this is based on the 20 pixels initially that we defined from the testimonial class. But this is stroke through here because the 2m is applied. Now, but if I take 20 pixels times 2, then I got 40 pixels. So there seems to be some kind of calculation related to this m unit. So let's keep that in mind and let's have a look at another element, the h2 element right here. Because there, in general, it would be the same behavior. We also have this 1.5m, but we also defined a font size of 18 pixels. Therefore, this is the value that is applied. But if I unselect this value now, then you can see that 1.5m gets active. And if we again go to compute it right here, you can see that now we have 30 pixels. And interestingly, it's again 20 pixels times 1.5, well, this results in 30. So again, we see that m is calculated based on the actual size of our element, which is inherited from the parent, and then multiplied by this factor right here. So we are diving deeper and deeper into m now. Let's have a look at the paragraph at the last element inside our testimonial info class right here. This paragraph doesn't have any font sizing applied. It simply inherits the font size of 20 pixels of our testimonial class. So we have a nice mixture of a fixed font size for our container here, for our testimonial class. Then we have testimonial info, which also inherits the 20 pixels. And then we have these m values for h1 and h2. And we have p, where we defined a font size. For h2, we also defined a font size. Sorry for that. So how can we now make this font size a bit more dynamic? Because let me first reload the page. We still have the problem that if we change the font size right here, as we did it before, We don't have any impact though onto our text right here. And this should definitely change. Now for that we have different ways to approach this issue. The easiest one would be to simply say, okay, why don't we just change the font size right here, this 20 pixels, to this M we just saw, because M apparently multiplies a value and by that seems to be more dynamic. So let's do that by going to the customer CSS file and now change the font size of 20 pixels to, let's say, 1.2M, because we saw that 1M is apparently equal to 16 pixels, so 1.2 seems to be a nice approximation. Let's do that, like this, and reload the page. As you can see, it's slightly smaller, but if I inspect that class right now, and so the testimonial class, and go to compute it, we can see that we have a font size of 19.2 pixels. This is basically 16 pixels times 1.2. And as this 16 pixels is actually specified by our browser settings right here, and if we go to very large with that, we can see that the font size also increases, because now we have 28.8 pixels, which is 24 pixels times 1.2. Now with that, things got a bit more dynamic. Let's change it back to the initial value though, like that. The problem still is that we don't have the entire control of all our elements. The H1 element, for example, still has the font size applied by the browser. So let's also change that by going to the testimonial name class, which we have right here, and now apply such a font size of 2M right here. If we do that and reload the page, nothing changes, but now we are the ones who define that 2M should be applied. So it's not depending on the browser anymore, but we are the ones who specify this code. For the H2 class, we have this font size of 18 pixels. And well, that's not what we want, right? Because we want to make things dynamic. This means if we keep it the way it is right now and we increase the font size to large again in the browser, we can see that the founder of techanalysis.com text remains at 18 pixels, so not the best thing to do. So let's also change that to medium, like that, and work on the testimonial subtitle class. This is the class right here. And let's change this font size to 1.1M maybe, because we saw 1M, if we have the default browser size of 16 pixels, is close to this 18 pixels. If we reload that, we see it's slightly bigger. Let's see why. Now, what's that issue? This is strange, right? Because I actually said that it's 1.1M, so the normal size times 1.1, but now it's too big. Well, that's basically the problem of M. As we can see right here, M inherits the previous sizes and by that multiplies the M with the previous M. Now, what do I mean by that? We have the 16 pixels defined in the browser. In our testimonial class, we specified 1.2M. This means we already have a font size of 19.2 pixels. Now, this value then also gets inherited by our testimonial subtitle class and then again multiplied by 1.1, which leads to our 21.12 pixels. The 1.5 right here are not taken into account because, as we can see, H2 and H1 are neighbors. So the inheritance takes place between H1 and this div with the class testimonial info. And because of that, you can quickly get into trouble by having lots and lots of M's and all that inheritance and multiplications. And to make it short, this can quickly become a mess. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't use M at all. It can be helpful if you have a specific use case where you want to define the font size of specific parts of your website with these M units. So I don't want to tell you never use M. I just want to tell you be careful right here. Because there is another approach which helps us to avoid exactly these issues. And this is the rem unit. Because if we now simply go back to our code and change 1.1M to 1.1 rem and reload the page, then you can see that the font size right here of our H2 class looks a lot better. And the reason for that is simply that now we have a font size of 17.6 pixels, Why is this happening? Well, because the only calculation that is done right now is the code is told to do the following. Just take the font size that is set by the browser settings, so 16 pixels in our case, and multiply it with 1.1, because rem, the R in rem, stands for root. So we always go back to the root element of our website, which is the HTML element, and with that, the browser default, which defines the size for that root element, in all cases where you don't change this default behavior. I showed you how this works. And as the font size always depends on this browser settings, the user has the full control of the size he wants to have on his website. And we can simply specify all our sizes or font sizes, for example, based on this rem value. This means we can also go back now and change the 2m for the testimonial name to 2rem. This means 2 times the size of the root element, so 16 pixels in our case. And also change it right here for the font size of the testimonial class to 1.2 rem. If we now reload, we can see the page looks basically the same way it did before. And if we now change our font size right here, like that, you can see that all elements inside our testimonial class now change the font size depending on the settings of the user. And that's actually the cool thing about rem. You can easily specify the font size, or also other sizes, of course. It's not restricted to fonts only. The important thing to keep in mind, though, is that rem and m always refer to the font size. That's the basic size value that they take into account. But you can also use rem for margins, for example. We'll see how this works. But with that rem approach, you really got a powerful tool to make your fonts more flexible and make it easier for the user to display the website the way he prefers it to be displayed. There used to be one downside of rem though. As rem is a rather new approach, the browser support wasn't the best. But if we go to caniuse.com again, right here, and now enter rem, well, you can see that browser support in the more recent versions of all modern browsers is pretty decent. Therefore, rem is a really nice unit to use if you want to change your font size and also other properties. I'll dive into that in the next lectures. And with that, we could actually use that new knowledge we gained now and apply it to our customers page, because we have more than these few font sizes we changed up to now. So how can we use this knowledge that we have about M and specifically rem? Because in the last video we changed the font size of some elements to rem, but I told you that you can apply rem not only to font sizes, of course, but also to other properties. And in addition to that, we might have more font sizes that we want to change. Before we do that, always keep in mind that the rem, no matter if you apply it as a font size or a margin, for example, always refers to the font size though. So the calculation basis for rem is the initial font size of the HTML element. Let's see what I mean by that. Because if we go back to the customers page, then we have our font size here for the testimonial class. This is totally fine. But then we have this margin here. This is interesting because it's a property we didn't use so far in connection with rem. This margin is set to 48 pixels. So this could be free rem because, as I said, the default font size of our browser is 16 pixels. So free rem would be 3 times this default font size. Well, and this would be 48 pixels. But then, of course, applied to the margin property. So I would prefer making this margin also more dynamic. So I'm talking about this margin here, this top and bottom margin. And you can, of course, also do that. But it's important to keep in mind that by making this margin more dynamic, the margin will, of course, also increase or decrease depending on the font size setting in the browser. Now let's apply a margin of 3 rem right here, like that. And let's maybe see what this looks like. If I reload the page, nothing changed because, let me show you this once again, the computed margin right here is now 48 pixels. And by the way, I forgot that we also have our top margin right here. You remember we specified a top margin for first of type. So this first of type margin also has to be adjusted because at the moment the change we made for the rem only affects the bottom margin, but not the top margin. We'll change that soon. But if we look at this gap now between the two images and now change the font size to very large again, right here, then you can also see that this gap right here, inspect that, it increased because the bottom margin now, although you cannot really see it very well right here, increased to 72 pixels. That's important to keep in mind. That's what I meant when I said be careful when you use the rem for margins, for example. It's not a problem to do it. You only have to know that this will be the effect. However, I like to use rem right here. I think this is fine. We have the width. This is okay with the 80%. Then we have this first of type margin. Here we should change it to rem also. So this should be 69 pixels. So 6 times 16 is 69. So this should be 6 rem, like that. As you can see, nothing changed right here. Then let's go on. We have the width and the max width defined. I might come back to this max width in the responsive part because we have these pixels right here. I'm not sure yet if I want to keep the pixels, but for the moment, this is okay. Then we have this box shadow here. This is this nice shadow we have around our image container. Now, you could change this to rem also if you want to, but I would not recommend doing it. Why am I saying this? Well, I don't think that the box shadow is something that should increase or decrease with the actual font size. I think a shadow should just be there, it should be visible, but increasing the shadow a lot, I don't think this helps improving the accessibility and maybe readability of the content of your site. So I will stick to pixels right here, and this will also be the approach we follow throughout this course. Then we have the image with the width of 100%. This is totally fine, as I think. Then we are in the testimonial info class. So this is the class right here, this one. So basically the element wrapping our text. Here we have the padding of 14 pixels. Well, for the padding, I would approach it with the same rationale we had for the margin. I changed the margin to rem, so the margin increases and decreases with the font size setting in the browser. In the end, it depends on your personal preferences, but I think if we do this for the margin, doing it for the padding is a good idea. We have 14 pixels right here. Let's maybe change it to 0.9 rem. This should be 14.4 pixels. So let's reload the page. As you can see, not a lot of change. And if we go to the computed value, you can see that we have a padding of 14.4 pixels to all sides. So this is nice. With that, we also have the padding in a more dynamic way. The width of 30% is fine. Then we have the margin again for the testimonial name. So this time we are in this class right here. Well, I think we also change it to rem, so 3 pixels. This should be around about 0.2 rem, like that. And if we go further down, we have the testimonial subtitle. This is already changed, so this is fine. And in the end, we have the margin for testimonial text. Well, I think we follow again our approach of applying 0.2 rem right here, like that. With that, our CSS file is a lot more dynamic now. I talked about the image container where we might have to come back in the responsive part. But generally, if I reload the page now and change the font size to very large, let's see. We can see it's indeed large. The gap also increased, but the general styling is okay in my opinion, because now everything right here is more dynamic. The navbar is also not fixed yet, of course. We'll work on that throughout the course. But generally, I think we achieved a lot so far just by adding this rem unit to our website right here. And with that, I'm now handing over to you, because now it's time for your challenge. Because we finished this customers part, at least from the rem perspective. But we also have this packages page right here. This is the page you mainly created on your own. On this packages page, we have the same issue. If we go to our packages CSS file right here, we can see that the padding is still pixels. We can see that the margin is still pixels. The border can remain as pixel. This is actually the same logic I explained when talking about the box shadow, so I wouldn't change the border. But if you go through that site, you will find a lot of properties where it definitely makes sense to change them from pixels to the corresponding RAM unit. Always keep in mind that the basic setting in the browser, so the default setting, is 16 pixels. So 1 RAM is 16 pixels. This means, for example, for the padding top, you would apply 2 RAM right here. And with that, this is your chance to practice this RAM unit. Feel free to also apply M if you want to, but as I said, I personally prefer RAM, to be honest, and we'll also follow the RAM approach throughout this course. And with that, I wish you good luck, have fun with RAM, play around, and in the next video, we'll have a look at it together. So how was it? Are you a, well, RAM lover right now? In case you had some problems, let's have a look at it together now. Now, as I said, for the padding top, we can simply change that 32 pixels into 2 RAM, so 2 times 16 pixels. Then we have our width and height with 100%. This is totally fine. Max guided you through that. Here we have the margin, which we can definitely change to 1 RAM also. We know how this works now. I also told you that I will keep the border as pixels, as I don't want to have this really huge borders if we have a larger default font size. You can apply RAM here if you want to. As I said, not my preference, therefore we'll leave it like that. Same thing is true for the box shadow right here. We'll also stick to pixels. For the package A, we have our padding of 32 pixels. So again, something we should change right here to 2 RAM. Regarding our margin for our badge, so for this thing right here, this recommended badge, well, let's also add RAM right here maybe. I think this is totally fine. Let's say 1.2 RAM, like that. Let's see what this looks like. Yeah, I think this is okay. Then we have a padding of 8 pixels, which should be 0.5 RAM, like that. And then we have package info. So I think you know how it works, so we can do it a bit faster now. 1 RAM. The border will remain the way it is. We will change the font size to 1.2 RAM right here, like that. And then we are actually done, as I think we have a border. Yeah, that's it actually. So with that, we also fixed this package page right here. And this is also totally dynamic now, so no more pixels in here. And as we have to repeat the same procedure for the shared and the main CSS file, I will now simply jump to the stage where I applied all these changes. You can find the code after adding these changes attached to this video. So simply change the CSS code of the shared and the main CSS file. And after I edit these changes, I'll be back. So with that finished, as I said, just copy the code you can find attached to the video into the shared CSS and the main CSS file. And if we now look at our website, it looks all right, so nothing broke apparently. And if we increase the font size to very large right now, let's see what happens, like this and like that, then we can see that the starting page looks okay, no big issues. We have the packages side, which looks all right actually. And we have our customer side, which also looks okay. So our RAM update turned out to work fine. Our page gets looking better and better. Let me just guide you through 2 or 3 or some things that I changed or that I did not change. For example, in the shared CSS file, you can see that I didn't change this calculation so far. We might work on that later, but not as of now. And you can also see that I left the border radius to a pixel value. It's again the same rationale I talked about when we left the box shadow or the border in general as a pixel value. The rest is actually straightforward. as we did it all the time. Here again, another border radius. And in the main CSS file, I deleted the padding we had right here in our product overview ID selector. There was a padding of 10 pixels. I don't think we need that anymore. That's why I got rid of it. Another thing that I left in pixels is down here, our key feature image. These are these images we have down here to see how awesome our page is. We will work on these later also in the responsive part. Therefore, I didn't change the units of these images as of now. But generally, for the majority of our website right here, the rem unit is now applied. So with rem and m being finished and applied, we can now continue with the last unit that I would like to show you as part of this module. For that, do you remember this backdrop right here that we added to our HTML files? We commented it out so far with the display none declaration right here. So let me maybe add it once again so that you can see it. So it works totally fine. We don't have any problems with it. But I told you that there is a second approach how to create such a backdrop. Mainly because we refer to the viewport with the position fixed property. And I said to you that this is one way how to do this, but we have another unit which makes it also easy for us to create such backdrops, for example. Let's have a look at this unit in the next lecture. So what can we now do with viewport height and viewport width? Let's find that out in this lecture, but before we do that, let's quickly go once again to the packages CSS file, because I have to admit I forgot something. I forgot to change the package badge font size, because this is still at 12 pixels, and this should rather be, let's say, 0.8 rem. I think that's the better unit for that. With that change being applied, we can now focus onto the viewport units. For this purpose, we will go to the shared CSS file right here and work on our backdrop again, because the viewport height and width units will simply be placed right here. So the VW, viewport width, to the width property, and the viewport height will be placed right here at the height property. Now, just adding these letters right here won't help us a lot. We also have to specify the viewport width, and let's maybe start with 100 right here and also 100 for the height, like that. If we now comment out our display none declaration right here, because the backdrop should not be hidden anymore, and reload the page, we can see that we have our backdrop back on our website. It behaves as it did before. You can see it like this and like that. So this generally works fine. This is also important to understand before we continue. For the situation we have right here, when we added position fixed to our selector right here, then the difference between width 100% or height 100% or adding the viewport units like that is not really there. As I said in the other video, this is just a different approach to achieve the same result in this case. In a few minutes, we'll have a look at another example where we can relate the width and the height of our element to the viewport, although the position property is not set to fixed. So just wanted to make this clear, because at the moment there is no real difference to the previous solution. However, let's have a closer look at that viewport units right here. Because what happens if I change this now to 80, like that? Well, as you might have guessed, now we only have the backdrop covering 80% of the width of our viewport. And that's actually what these numbers basically mean. It's basically a percentage number. This just indicates that it always refers to the viewport, and that's the important difference. We could also apply a height of 50%, for example, right here, and with that, it would look like that. So I think the general logic of this viewport unit is clear. It simply allows us to, as I said, always refer our sizes to the actual viewport, no matter which position property we have right here. But there are two more units for this viewport that we can use. One of these is vmin, this one right here. Let's see if this changes a thing. Yes, we can see now our width became a bit smaller. What's the reason for that? Well, 𝗧𝗜𝗏 simply takes 80% of the smaller viewport. And in our case, if we make this bigger, we can see it doesn't increase the width, because in our case, the smaller viewport is of course the height. So the height is smaller than our width right here. Now what does this mean? I can increase the width as far as I want because it will always take 80% of the smaller viewport. But it's not always 80% of the height. Because if I reduce that, at a certain point, and that's exactly the point where the height and the width are equal, and now the width right here, the width of the viewport becomes smaller than the height, and because of that, now it jumps to taking 80% of the viewport width. Let me repeat that. Now we have 80% of the viewport width because the viewport width is smaller, so this viewport is smaller than the height. As soon as the height becomes smaller than the width, which is right now, can you see it at this point? The backdrop doesn't increase anymore because it now takes 80% of the smaller distance, which in that case is the height. Now, in addition to 𝗧𝗏min, we also have 𝗧𝗏max, which, as you can imagine, simply works the other way around. So if I reload, we can see that the width increased because now we take 80% of the larger distance between the width and the height of the viewport. So right here, it keeps increasing because our width is a lot bigger than the height. But as soon as the height becomes bigger than the width, as you can see, it doesn't move anymore because the height is now a constant value. We don't change it. So it always takes 80% of the height without any adjustment of the backdrop. And that's it actually regarding this shared CSS file. I will change this back to 100 viewport width and 100 viewport height because this is actually what we need right here. As you can see right here, it works fine. But with viewport height, viewport width, and especially with 𝗧𝗏min and 𝗧𝗏max, you can easily create such overlaying elements basically and stick them to the viewport. Now, talking about sticking them to the viewport, let me quickly comment this in again and reload the page. And let's now stop working on the backdrop. Let's now have a quick look at our picture right here. Because if we go to our main CSS file now, we can see that we defined the height of this image with 528 pixels. So this height right here. Now, as we are not the biggest fans of such values and the image actually always can refer to the viewport, I don't think that's a big problem. Why don't we just change the pixel value to a viewport unit? The only question is, which one should we take? Well, I would say we use VH, so the viewport height, but which number should we add? Well, as we saw, the image has 528 pixels height, and our HTML element, so everything we see right here, has 1600 pixels height. Well, I would say that maybe 33% of the viewport height might be a good value for that. Let's see what this looks like. We can see that our image is now smaller, and to be honest, I prefer this look. The problem though is that it's a little bit, well, far down now, so I would like to see a bit more of the top of the image. So let's quickly jump back and work on the background image. Let's change bottom to maybe 60%. Let's see what this looks like. Yeah, almost, not totally happy. Let's say 70% maybe even, because I would like to see this woman a bit more. Yeah, I think this looks cool. This has this kind of freedom-like look that we want to have. So this definitely improved our website. And actually, we could also change the width to 100 VW like that, because why shouldn't we do it the same right here? If we do that, nothing changes, but now both units refer to the viewport like that. And I think this looks pretty cool now. What we also saw is that although the position property of this background image was position relative, and as you learned, position relative, so the units of these elements do not refer to the viewport, just by adding VW and VH, we were able to simply change this behavior and because of that, easily adjust our image according to the viewport. With that, we could actually conclude VH and VW, but unfortunately there is one, little downside regarding this unit. If we go again to caniuse.com and look, for example, for VH, we can see that browser support is generally pretty good. But for the Internet Explorer 11 right here, there is only a partial support. The partial support, luckily, only refers to the Vmax unit, which is not supported. So the VH, VW, and Vmin units are supported. Therefore, the issue is not the biggest one, but having a look at caniuse.com before using a specific unit is definitely a good idea. And always keep in mind that using position fixed, for example, in combination with percentage values for width and height is always a good alternative. The problem now is, though, that you might still be confused and you might not be sure, which unit to use in connection with which property. And I think this is something we should have a closer look at in the next lecture. So, which unit should I choose? Well, we basically have different properties, we saw that, and we have a recommended unit. And before we dive into that, have a look at the quotation marks around recommended. Because as always in CSS, there are better and worse ways to achieve a goal. Therefore, this recommendation is also part of my personal experience, of course. Therefore, feel free to change that, of course, depending on the needs of your project. But I think to give you a general guidance, this slide might be really helpful in the future. So, having said that, let's have a look at the properties we had, because we know our properties, right? Let's start with the font size property. Important, the root element. We talked about that when we decided if we want to add a specific font size to our HTML element. One recommended unit is percentage. We had a look at that. Applying 100%, doesn't make a lot of sense, but you can do that if you want to. But you could apply 75% or some value below 100% in case you want to make sure that the default font size on your website is smaller than the browser setting. Another possible unit is, of course, this one, nothing. And that's also the one we use in this course because I explained that. We want to decide how the font sizes change depending on specific elements, but in general, the font size can be in line with the browser setting. The second property we can use to apply some units to is the font size in general. Here we saw that rem is probably a nice idea to follow. It's easy to use, it's easy to see also for other developers, and if you didn't apply any kind of specific font size to the root element, it's always clear that the font size with rem refers to this root element. You can also use M, we saw that, but I would recommend only using it for children, so not some M chains, so applying M to the parent, to the child, and to other childs, because you saw it in the example, it can get messy quickly, and I'm not sure if you like that. But as I said, I do not recommend just using rem actually. You can use both and play around. I personally prefer rem though. The next properties are the padding and the margin. We saw that in our example on the website, we used rem for both. Of course, if you want to have a different behavior and you say you want to have fixed margins between the elements, feel free to not apply rem right here. Then we had the border, where we followed a different approach. For the border, we used pixels, because my rationale is that a border should just, be a border, but I don't want to have a border of, 30 pixels in the end. That's definitely not something you normally want, so I would recommend using pixels for borders. Then we had width and height, and for these we have two options. We can either use percentages. The important thing about percentages though is that we always have to be aware of the containing block. which depends on the position property applied to our element. We were diving into that in a lot of detail. And we can use VW or VH, viewport width, viewport height, or view min, view max. We also saw that. Which one do I recommend? Well, to be honest, it depends, of course, on what you want to achieve. If you want to relate your width or height to the viewport, I think choosing the viewport unit is definitely not a bad idea. On the other hand, you can also solve this issue with the position fixed property, for example, and percentages. So again, you are free to choose either of the two, because I would stick in most cases to these. An exception right here is maybe max width or min width. We saw that. There it's also possible to use pixels, because you might want to set a real pixel-based limit for your maximum width of specific elements. I also showed you an example how this would work. Now for the top and bottom properties, so how we can move our elements, well, I would normally stick to percentages, because there you normally need the relation to your containing block, so why wouldn't you use percentages? Definitely a good idea right here. The same thing is true for left and right, of course. There, using percentages would also be my recommendation. Now, I said it in the beginning, and I have to repeat myself, this is not the final and definite guidance how to approach such problems, but it's supposed to be a good starting point for you in case you are not sure about a specific property and which unit might be a good selection in combination with that property. With that, we are getting closer towards the end of this module. There is one quick tip though, another one that I have for you that can help you to quickly center your elements. Let's have a look at this tip in the next lecture. So how can we easily center our elements? Well, to be honest, we already applied this value I want to show you right now. That's why it's just a quick tip. But I want to make sure that we also saw this as part of this units module. The value I'm talking about is the one we, for example, used here in our plan list. Because as you can see, the elements are centered. And the reason why this works is that if we go to our main CSS file, and then go down to plan list, is this one right here, margin auto. Because if I would comment that out now, just for testing purposes, like that, and reload the page, you can see that the items are obviously not centered. Now you could play around and define a margin left, right of X%, and with that center your element. But with margin auto, this is automatically done by the browser basically. And as you can see, with that, we easily can center our elements perfectly and make our lives a bit easier. Now, margin auto is not always the perfect solution, of course, but I just want you to keep that in mind in case you have issues like that. So we now also got this in our minds. So in the next lecture, it's time to have a last look at our code in this module and see if we have to clean up our code a bit and maybe adjust some values to one of the units we just learned about. So we learned a lot of new units in this module, and we actually applied a lot of them in our project. So in this lecture, I just want to add one additional of these new units, because I saw that in the packages file, we still use width 100% and height 100%. We use position fixed, so it's not a big problem, but I would like to change the background on our packages side also to 100 viewport width and 100 viewport height. VH, not WH, like that. So if I go back and go to the packages page, we can see that the image still is positioned as it was before, but now we also have this units aligned with the image we have right here on our main site, where we also have the viewport units. That's it. That was our code cleaning up. Was quite easy actually. So let me now summarize what we learned in the next video. So what have we learned throughout this module? Well, we basically learned that we have different units available in CSS. We have pixels and percentages. These were the ones we already used throughout this course so far. But then we also saw that we have rem and m, so these units that refer to the font size. And we have viewport units, VH and VW, Vmin, Vmax. In addition to that, I also showed you that using auto, especially for margins, can also be a really nice helper in case you want to align your objects to the center of your website. We also had a look at the containing block, which is basically the reference point whenever we apply percentage units to our element. The containing block basically depends on the position property that is applied to our element. Generally, the containing block is either the closest ancestor or the viewport. We had a detailed look at that, so we also saw the different combinations we have. For example, we also saw that if we have the position fixed declaration applied to our element, then the containing block is not the closest ancestor, but the viewport. If we have the position absolute declaration applied, then the closest ancestor, which also has a position property applied, is our containing block. And we saw that if we have position static or relative applied, that the closest ancestor, which is a block level element, is our containing block. In addition to that, we also had a look at the 100% height issue, because we saw that if our element itself and the ancestors both use the position static or relative value, then applying 100% height to our element is not working. We saw that if we add a height of 100% to the ancestors, this issue is fixed. Another fix for the issue that we saw was that we could simply use position fixed or absolute, or simply use viewport units, VW or VH. Regarding this, we also had a look at browser compatibility. We saw the small limitations the Internet Explorer had, for example. We also had a look at the min-max width property, and we saw that if we combine a normal width property with one of these properties, by the way, both are also available for the height, of course, well, if we combine these, we saw that we can easily restrict the size of an element, for example, setting the max width to make sure that our image is not displayed too big on larger screens. Same thing was true for the min width when we said that we wanted to make sure that our image doesn't get too small. This was our first step towards a more responsive design, but we will dive into the details about that in the separate module. We also had a look at M and rem. These are the units which depend on the font size. We saw that rem always depends on the font size of the root element, so the HTML element, and m depended on the size of the element itself. This means our element used inheritance to get the font size of the ancestor, and then multiplied this value with the m value applied. We also saw that m and rem, although these depend on the font size, are not restricted to the font size property. We also used rem, for example, for our margins. And this is it actually. These are the core concepts you should understand now to make sure that you are really familiar with the units in CSS. Now with that, I will hand over back to Max, who will now give you a short JavaScript introduction, because we created our nice backdrop in this module, but the backdrop at the moment is not really working because we only have the option to comment in or comment out display none. Not the best solution, as I would say, so let's see how we can make this a bit more dynamic.